to teach them the constructs. So we're embedding that technology in the instructional tool, and so you'll have an interactive flipping between assessment and instruction, custom designed to respond to the learning needs identified in the assessment. Okay, so that's tool to fix one market efficiency, which the practice doesn't have access to good tools that are cheap enough and easy enough to use and reliable enough. We think we have a fix. The second package of stuff is something called segmentation analysis. These are about 1.5 years old. We've done them for 7 provinces, for the federal government, and for all 3 territories. And until Tuesday of this week, no province would let this data out because it's literacy demand, literacy supply, literacy shortages, what they would cost to fix, what they would yield in economic benefits, and the province has had an allergic reaction to them. But a positive one, they loved it, but they didn't want the data public because it would create expectations on their programs. So what you have are these 9 reports now, and we're working on a set of Aboriginal reports for every province and territory that profile supply, demand, shortages, costs, and benefits. The punchline here is the average rates of return on investment with a simple rate of return, 500% a year forever. So that's better than a Canada savings bond, I've told you. And so the case for governments and employers is overwhelming. There's also 700 megabytes of tables because we did these analysis using the census with literacy scores on there. And so you can talk about every industry, every occupation, and every geography. And the story there is literacy shortages are exactly where you'd think they are. They're in clerical occupations, sales and service, in terms of the absolute numbers of people at risk. But if you look at who's most likely at risk, you start to get teachers and nurses. So I'll leave you with one fact. 96% of the registered nurses in Canada have skill levels lower, reading skill levels lower than the essential skills profiles say they should have to do their job properly. Scary. And then finally, what I was really paid to come here to do, well, I wasn't paid, but whatever. I'm a pensioner. This market failure I mentioned earlier, part of it is the fact that municipal politicians and the people that work for them and employers don't get this problem yet. And part of the reason they don't get it is they don't have any information to quantify the problem. So we produced, using the same database that we did the segmentation analysis, community report cards. Uses the 2006 census microfile, and it provides literacy skill demand, literacy skill supply, skill shortages and surpluses, and the cost and benefits of eliminating both surpluses and shortages. And it's based on this analysis. This is taking those measures of decoding and comprehension and looking at for patterns in those in order to identify groups of learners that share common strengths and weaknesses and thus would benefit from specific interventions. And the basic package, all this tells you is that there's 4 basic types of learners, each of which needs more help. The people down here are still far away from fluid and automatic reading. They got problems with decoding. They have vocabulary problems. Their working memories are small. There's strong evidence of learning disabilities. And then the people up here have practically no problems with those comprehension things. They're almost perfect, but not quite perfect. So they need much less and much more focused group interventions. So this, the PowerPoint will be available, but it's the key point here is we can define each of these groups in terms of their learning needs and their characteristics, and magically the IELTS data turns into like what program people think of the world. It's the men that bumped their heads and didn't graduate from high school, immigrant women without education, immigrant women with education, and then sort of everybody else. And most of the problem is not down in the bottom of level 1 and illiteracy. It's all in the mid to top of level 2, where people can actually read pretty well, have pretty good decoding and comprehension skills, but not good enough to get to level 3 where the jobs are. So now, examples of the actual report cards, which are still a work in progress. We have the reports up for Ontario, and throughout this week, we'll add provinces on a daily basis. I'm going to show you the one from Toronto, and it's, I think, a 3-page for each of 840 communities. And it has a summary that says why this is important, what the basic numbers are, and then goes through the basic numbers in some detail telling you why you should pay attention. So this is the summary table for Toronto, to give you an idea of what's there. It rates people on the economic demand for literacy because communities differ. Some communities have good skill-demanding jobs, and some have rotten skill-demanding jobs. Come back to my thesis that governments, broadly defined, need to pay more attention to creating skill and knowledge-rich jobs, or we're going to be in economic trouble. So this is, I think, the CMA of Toronto. They're ranked 53 out of 840, and they get an A rating because their jobs are pretty high on the overall list. The second element is we profile the aggregate supply of literacy skill. You know that we put people on a scale. We've never been able to talk about that scale in real terms like you can talk about money. But now that we have those components of reading, we can pin the bottom end of the scale and say 0 actually means a complete absence of literacy, and we can pin the top end of the scale, and so we can talk about literacy just like we talk about money. And Toronto has over 1 billion points of literacy that they could put to economic and social purposes. The third element is what that translates into what on average each worker has. So 282, which is greater than 275, so it's just in level 3, pretty good. The fourth element is of the available supply, how much is the economy making use of? In this case, in Toronto, it's 67%, which is okay by Canadian standards. But if you were to push that up, every percent yields a huge gain in GDP and in people's incomes. So to get some sense of that, if you used best practice interventions and the profile of learning needs in Toronto, we can come up with an estimate that it would take $3 billion to eliminate the occupational literacy skill shortages in the CMA of Toronto. That's a lot of money. It's about $1,731 per person. So the first question I want to ask you, because most of you are in the practice, how many of you are getting $1,731 per participant? So the first warning is, this is what the science and the best practice says you need to do the job. And if you're trying to do it with less, you either better be awfully lucky, awfully clever, or you're self-defeating. The next thing is where we start to get interesting. Because we have these international databases, we can partial out what the economic benefits would be for every single additional literacy point. And it works out to be $155 a point in additional earnings. And we can use that to estimate, so if we got rid of these shortages, what would happen. And in Toronto, on an annual basis, you'd get $11 billion more in GDP. And you divide those two, you get a pretty nice rate of return. That means that every worker in Toronto would get another $7,500, maybe. And this is where we get into the public policy trickster thing. We know from the data that that's the economic value that would be generated. The question is, would firms pass that value along to their workers as higher wages and benefits, or would they retain those by reducing their prices, improving their quality, investing in research and development? So the value is there. The fight is about how it gets divided up. And then finally, because, go back to those markets, they're not very good at matching worker skills with the demands of the occupations they're in. There's also some much smaller surpluses than shortages. And if we got rid of those by taking skills that are already there and making people use them on the job, you can get another $2 billion in added value. So then the rest of the report just goes through that line of reasoning and explains what the data mean and what local politicians and firms can do about it, what the policy levers are. So we rate them on their utilization rates, the size of the shortages, the cost of the shortages, and describe each of the segments. And so when we get here, those components I showed you, the decoding and comprehension, for each city form this. We get 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 different groups of learners. A1 are men who bump their heads. No high school graduation, evidence of dyslexia and other learning disabilities. Lousy decoding and comprehension. Practically none of them. Immigrant women with very low levels of education, so they probably don't have literacy in their own languages. So that's about 7% of the estimated number of learners in Toronto. Men who graduated from high school, but just only that. Also problems with decoding and comprehension. Educated immigrant women. And then we get interesting. C people have modest problems with decoding and comprehension. Mostly they have weakness in vocabulary. So they're not fluent and automatic readers, and thus they don't have the skills to get to level 3. These are people, the Ds, so a quarter of the problem in Toronto are people who have mastered the act of reading, so they've learned to read. They can't read. Read to learn. So they're unable to master those things that you need to get level 3 or higher items done. Dealing with conditional information, making low and high level inferences. And then we get 2 additional groups. These are people who are at level 3 and need level 4 or 5 for their jobs. And these are people who are at level 4 but need level 5. And so you see if you were thinking like that small business person and wanting to make money or do good, the action's all here and in Toronto in the immigrant women with low levels of education. So this matters for what products you have, it matters for how and where you market, and it matters for how you evaluate your success. So this is going to be for every place in the country. So I'm going to just show you as another example Mount Pearl in Newfoundland, where they rank, it's a suburb of St. John, if I'm correct? Yep. They rank 8 out of 840 communities in Canada. So they're really high up there. And so don't fulfill the stereotype many Canadians have. They have a score of 296, which puts them well up into level 3. Unlike the overall Newfoundland economy, which only uses about 51% of the literacy supply, the Mount Pearl economy uses 66%. And so that shows up in what people earn there. Still, there's shortages that would take about $7 million to fix, or $1,100 to fix per person. It would generate $40 million more in earnings on an annual basis, or $6,600. And as an aside, who can tell me what the average